Gardeners, farmers, consumers, what you used to be able to grow here in Minnesota may not be doing so well anymore. Crops that used to do well south of us now thrive here. What's going on? Well, the USDA's Hardiness Index maps are changing. Yes, the Hardiness Index is a thing, and we here in the upper Midwest are less hardy than we used to be.
Now, this is Talking Points on CBS News Minnesota.
Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. Tonight we'll take a look at what these USDA hardiness zones mean to you, to our farmers, and to consumers. First, we'll hear from WCCO Director of Meteorology, Mike Augustyniak, who will explain how these changes are happening more rapidly in Minnesota and the upper Midwest than in other places. We'll also talk to a leading gardening expert at the University of Minnesota about what changes you may want to make to what you are planting in your own yard and garden. And we'll also take a look at the impact on Minnesota's $21 billion agricultural economy. Let's start with WCCO's Director of Meteorology. And as always, when we have these kinds of questions, we turn to our friend Mike Augustyniak, who not only is Director of Meteorology here at WCCO, but he is also a certified consulting meteorologist. Basically, Mike, what is going on? Why are we seeing these dramatic changes in climate zones?
Well, there are two main reasons. One is that when we get these updates every 10 years or so, we also incorporate new technology and a proliferation of things like more personal weather stations. So there is some amount of this change that we've seen, particularly in the past 30 years, to these maps that is related purely to more observations. People can now afford their own personal weather stations. You don't need to be a government entity. And so more observations equals a better map overall.
Got it.
The other thing, the other factor that we're seeing, particularly in outlying areas, agricultural areas primarily, is the impacts of climate change. And these maps are really based on what is the most likely absolute coldest temperature that occurs during a 30-year period. So we're talking about those coldest days of winter, because those are the ones that can be really damaging to crops and to plants, particularly perennials. The warming here in Minnesota, particularly northern Minnesota, is among the fastest warming areas in the entire lower 48 states during the month of winter. And so because those more extreme winter cold temperatures are becoming less and less extreme, that's translating to a change in some of these zones.
Is there any reason why our warming is more extreme in northern Minnesota? Can you pinpoint some of the factors behind that?
Yeah, so the warming effects are kind of amplified at higher latitudes into the Arctic because there is such a big swing in how much sunlight we get the farther north you go at higher latitudes during the winter versus the summer. We're also seeing warming happen, particularly during the summer in southern parts of the U.S., in part because the ocean is heating up, and that is helping to raise temperatures overall. But most of what's happening in the northern tier of states across Canada and across Alaska is due to the melting of glaciers and ice, sea ice across the North Polar regions, and that's allowing warmer winters overall.
Do you expect this trend to continue in this way?
Absolutely. There is no way that we are going to reverse this warming trend globally or locally unless something changes about just the very basic, the 8th grade physics that's driving it. And that's the higher the amount of CO2 and methane in the atmosphere, greenhouse gases, the more warming you're going to have. Nothing is going to change that.
All right. Can you change the rate? You talked about how it's warming the fastest. I mean, can that be changed or manipulated in any way? Or?
I don't think you can pinpoint it and say, like, hey, let's make Minnesota warm less quickly. But yes, human activities and changing our human activities absolutely can slow this. But it's even if we stopped emitting all greenhouse gases today, we're probably going to continue to see a warming trend for decades to come because, like, do you remember the ozone hole and the chlorofluorocarbons, all the aerosol cans that were causing that? We stopped production of those, but then they stayed in the atmosphere for several decades. And CO2 and methane can stay in the atmosphere for decades to hundreds of years. And so at some point, we might stop producing all those, but they're still going to be up there floating around, creating a warming effect.
Now, I don't know if this is connected, but the farmers that I've spoken to, and I speak to some of them in this show, talk about extreme weather events and that just determining their entire season of growing, and that there are more and more of them. I've heard you talking about this. Is this all part of a general movement in that direction?
Yeah, so climate change supercharges the water cycle, and that results in both more droughts and also more heavy rain events. And what we have seen are patterns that seem to be setting up where it's not just a drought for a year or a drought for a month, but these patterns seem to keep revisiting and re-hitting some of the same areas. And the same can happen with flooding. So we could certainly switch at some point in the future here to an excessive rain period for a few years, just after we've had a couple of really bad dry seasons for drought. But we don't know when that's going to switch, and we certainly don't know exactly where those are going to set up.
All right. Well, Mike Augustyniak, thank you so much as always. We turn to you for these hard questions. We appreciate it.
I'm glad to help.
Up next, what the changes mean for what you may want to plant or not plant in your yard and garden. Well, joining us right now is Julie Weisenhorn. She is a University of Minnesota Extension horticulture educator, and you may know her as the co-host of WCCO Radio's Smart Gardens, where she and her co-hosts always have the answers. So thank you so much for coming on.
Glad to be here, Esme.
All right, what are people to make of these hardiness zone changes? Are people supposed to start growing different things now that most of the metro is in 5A, zone 5A, as opposed to zone 4?
Well, the important thing to do is remember that hardiness zone is only one factor for growing plants. So it's a place to start, definitely. We want to choose plants that are hardy in the zone that we live in. The USDA map, and including the previous one, which came out in 2012, has a feature where you can enter in your zip code and it will tell you the zone that you are gardening in. So that's a good way to start. And this map is particularly interesting because it has expanded the zone 5A zone, which is a zone that doesn't get as cold, into bigger parts of Minnesota. There's been quite a few changes. So I would recommend that gardeners take a look at their zone and, see what they can do. So.
Can you just list some of the zone 5A options that people may have not really considered before, or that you think would be, a good choice to, or at least to look at?
Sure. So I think actually gardeners in Minnesota will be pretty excited about zone 5A and the plant palettes that opens up for them. So I'll give you an example. One of my favorite plants that I saw in Chicago at the Morton Arboretum is an oak leaf hydrangea. And it's a big, beautiful shrub with these oak leaf type leaves and beautiful conical flowers, but it's a zone 5 plant. So that would be something that somebody could consider growing. Also, Japanese maples are very popular small trees and very, really beautiful foliage, beautiful color. And that might be something that somebody could feel a little bit more secure about trying to grow in their new 5A zone.
So this really is a game changer.
It's a major change for Minnesota gardeners. It is based on our annual average extreme temperature. So these are cold temperatures.
Right.
And the data that collected the data sets comes from Oregon State University. It's called the PRISM Climate Group. And they have become more and more precise with the technology. They use GIS technology and have been able to get very detailed, which is, I believe, one of the reasons we have such good maps going forward, starting with 2023.
So you feel really these maps are so much better than they ever were because it can be so determined down to your zip code.
Exactly. Now we were able to do that before in the 2012. That was the previous map that was released. But this one has just, according to what the USDA and PRISM have reported, that the detail is even finer. Wow. Because the technology is that much improved.
Is there anything that you find surprising as somebody who's been helping people garden in this area for so long?
Well, I'm surprised that it's taken us this long to get to a zone 5A around the Twin City area, because we have so much hardscape. We have asphalt and cement and buildings, and all of those things hold heat. And so, in some cases, people would come to me and they say, oh, I can grow Japanese maple. I've had one for years. And it's like, well, it's just a microclimate. It's just a special part of your landscape that you can grow in. But now I think we've gotten that better technology, and people are probably a little more confident going forward that they'll be able to grow these plants. And as I was stating earlier, hardiness zone is one thing, but then you also have to plant the plant correctly. You have to choose the right plant for the conditions you have, and you have to care for it appropriately. So you can start with the hardiness zone, but then you also want to continue with proper planting care and also the best selection.
And to find these zones in these maps, obviously you can go to your map, your website at the University of Minnesota.
Yep.
Where else should people look for advice on this sort of game-changing map here, maps that exist?
Well, definitely the USDA website is the first place they could actually go, because it also explains to them finer details and information about the map, how it's changed. For example, we've added 2 more zones in the United States. So this is a map that is for the US. So it also includes Alaska, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. And so we've expanded and added zones 12 and 13, primarily in Hawaii and Puerto Rico. So that's a big deal. And there are some areas that the zones have gone down. So in some cases, and I think that they call out Alaska, that some of those zones have actually become cooler zones. And it's
Wow.
because the data is that much better.
Well, listen, Julie, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and expertise.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Up next, what the changes mean for agriculture. We'll hear from an ag instructor and a prominent soybean grower. Joining us now are 2 experts from the University of Minnesota, David Nicolai. He's a professor and educator in field crops. And we also have Katie Black, who's an extension educator for climate adaptation and resilience. What are farmers doing right now about this?
Well, one of the things that farmers are doing are adapting varieties of crops that they're growing that take advantage of the length situations. And with that, if we have a warmer fall, we don't really have a freeze. And as early as we used to have, they will grow soybeans, say, for example, that are a longer maturity. And they'll take advantage of maybe in terms of zone, a longer relative maturity. With that, they'll also be able to plant a little bit more early. Some of the concerns that we have had, and like this last year, is if we have a dry situation, limited rainfall, is finding those crop varieties that can tolerate a drought or dry conditions. And that becomes more problematic. We have advances in breeding, and that becomes a situation with that. I think growers are also concerned about pastures, raising other types of forages and so forth in a drier climate. So that becomes problematic. And I think the last thing is they had to adapt crop insurance because of the fact that we really are at the mercy of a much more fluid climate. And whether we're dry or whether we're cold or too much rainfall or too little, we seem to have more storms and those types of situations. So that's costing farmers more money in terms of dealing with those situations.
Let me ask you, in terms of the bigger picture, is the whole of Minnesota agriculture really evolving because of this?
I think it's evolving as time goes along, and it's not a rapid involvement, but I think it's been a gradual involvement. Just the same as from a climate perspective. If we have things that change from year to year or month to month, that's more weather related. But they've been having to take a look at a number of things. One instance is their ability to grow crops much farther in northern Minnesota than we ever had before. So we can grow corn and soybeans all the way up to the tip of the Red River Valley, almost up to the Canadian border. And that in regard has made a change too. We don't grow as much small grain or as much wheat in those situations. So it's the cropping
And when has
systems
that
has
changed?
changed.
I mean, was that 20 years ago when they weren't growing those kinds of crops in the Red River Valley?
It's been within the last 25 to 30 years, or the adaptation. And then, of course, the varieties of crops that they've been able to find that can grow that are shorter season have been better adapted. So they've gone kind of hand in hand within it. But I would say basically it's been the last certainly within the last 25 to 30 years where that's been in. I think it's accelerated probably in the last 10 years.
Katie, with that kind of acceleration, 10 years in some ways is not that long a period. How are farmers looking ahead, and how are you looking ahead to what might potentially come down the road in another 10 years?
Yeah, so one thing that we are really focused on is emphasizing that we are living through a period of climate change right now. It's not something that is going to passively happen to us in the next 10 years. It's happening now. It's going to intensify over the next 20 to 30 years and the end of century in particular. One thing that we're really focusing on now, at least in my role, is thinking about how farmers can respond to pests as we see, fewer of those really cold freezes that we're used to in Minnesota. We're seeing increased precipitation on kind of the shoulder seasons of spring and fall. Which is actually when you don't want water on the farm. You would prefer to see it in the summer when your crops need it, but instead we're getting it at times where you have to think about how to manage that excess water, and it's not necessarily advantageous to have it.
You mentioned pests. Is there a whole new kind of crop, no pun intended, of pests that farmers have to deal with because of these changing zones?
I think we've had some more indications with insects such as corn rootworm, particularly the last several years that have been adapting from, there's a version from Western and a Northern, and that's changed. We sometimes have depended on really cold weather to help mitigate and limit the amount of pest infestation if it quote freeze out the insects, so to speak. And we haven't had that. And so that has been more problematic with that. It's some of the soybean aphids, some situation with that as well. In terms of we're dependent on these colder temperatures to slow things down and so forth. Now, some of our insects will come into Minnesota, but the overwintering aspect, I think that's a whole new ball game for a lot of Minnesota growers.
Overall, when you look at the climate change in these changing zones and what farmers are able to do if they keep up with the changes in the right way, is this a win for farmers or is it a loss? What's the change that's happening in our state?
It all depends, and I know that's a simplistic way to say that. And Katie can jump in there. There's certain things that you can do in terms of crop varieties, and if the plant bleeding picks up and so forth, we can still maintain good yields. But it is more problematic dealing with severity of storms and other things, flooding. Whether it is need for drainage and so forth. Certainly crop insurance. So there's some more additional input costs. You maybe get a higher gross yield on one side, but you may have other costs that you have to deal with as well.
Well, listen, thank you both so much. You've been very helpful. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joining us right now is Bob Worth. He has been farming in Lincoln County for 53 years, you just told me, Bob, and you are also the president of the Soybean Growers Association in Minnesota. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
In terms of where soybeans can be grown in Minnesota, has that changed?
Oh, yes. It's changed a lot. Because we used to just grow them in the southern part of Minnesota. Then we moved up to the central. Now we are all the way up to Canada. We are growing all the way to Canada. And some of that has done to do with genetics. They have created an earlier soybean that will yield very well. So genetics and the science has done a lot to help us to grow soybeans all across the whole state.
Why are Minnesota farmers not growing wheat as much as they used to?
Profitability, sustainability. The wheat just cannot keep up with corn and soybeans on as far as profitability. And, we all have to be sustainable, which means we got to show a profit if we're going to stay in this occupation. I mean, all occupations show that we have to have a profit. Otherwise, why do we want to stay here? And we will be out of business because the banks will say we can't continue to farm.
One of the things that climate change is doing is obviously creating more extreme weather events. Have you been affected by more extreme weather events, and have other farmers you talk to been affected by more extreme weather events?
Yes and no. Yes, we are getting extreme events, but it's not something new. I mean, we've had this before, but we all wonder why it's coming more often or what's causing it. And that's something the climate's going to help us understand what it is. But we need to find the facts that's causing it. We just don't want to jump in and say climate's doing. We got to know what is causing the climate to change.
In addition to soybeans, what other changes have you noticed in what people are growing in Minnesota?
Well, we grow a lot more corn than we ever used to, and we grow a lot more soybeans, and a lot less wheat, a lot less legumes, which is alfalfa. There's a lot less of that being planted, just for kind of profitability, and a lot less livestock in the state of Minnesota, and so they don't need the alfalfa, etc.
Okay. Anything else that you think people should know about the change in climate and its impact on Minnesota farmers?
You know, I just want to stress that agriculture is really trying hard. We have tried hard from day one to make this environment better. We want the water quality better. We want everything better. So that's why we are doing cover crops. That's why we're doing all the things that are important to our environment. Because as I move my land to the next generation, my son and my grandson, I want to make sure that it's in the quality of the land and the environment is much better than when I got it.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, for that. We also appreciate your time here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. As always, please reach out to me with comments and suggestions at esme@wcco.com. The show airs Wednesday and Thursday nights at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. And something new, the whole show will be posted to our YouTube channel by Friday evening, so you can watch and rewatch at any time. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.